There's a specific kind of tired that doesn't come from working too many hours. It's not the kind that disappears after a weekend of rest. It doesn't respond to sleep or coffee or 2 days away from the screen. It's a tiredness that sits somewhere deeper than the body, and most men carrying it have no name for it. They just feel heavier than they used to. You probably know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. A man who, on the surface, seems to be functioning, who shows up, who answers messages, who laughs at the right moments in conversations, who pays his bills, or tries to, who looks, from the outside, like someone holding it together. But behind that, somewhere underneath the routine and the performance, something has quietly been giving way. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself. That's the strange part. The collapse doesn't arrive like a breakdown. It doesn't come with a warning. It seeps in slowly, the way water finds its way into the walls of a building before anyone notices the damage. And by the time it becomes visible, it's been happening for a long time. We live in an era that produces a very specific kind of pressure on men. Not the old pressures, exactly, though those haven't disappeared. Something newer, something harder to articulate. A pressure that comes from every direction simultaneously and never quite declares itself as pressure. It just presents itself as life, as normal, as what everyone is dealing with. So most men absorb it quietly and keep moving. The economic part is real, and it's exhausting. Housing costs that make ownership feel like a fantasy designed for another generation. Grocery bills that require mental calculation in the middle of the aisle. Salaries that haven't moved emotionally even when the numbers suggest otherwise, because everything around them has inflated in ways that numbers don't fully capture. The particular humiliation of working consistently and still feeling financially precarious, of doing everything technically right and still feeling like you're falling behind some invisible standard that keeps moving. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Because the financial pressure alone doesn't fully explain the weight modern men carry, something else is operating beneath it, something quieter, a kind of identity erosion that happens so gradually that most men don't realize it's occurring until they're already several years inside it. For a long time, the way a man understood himself was structured around certain external anchors. Work that felt meaningful, financial stability that felt achievable, the ability to provide, to build something, to progress. These weren't always healthy frameworks, and many of them carried their own damage. But they were frameworks. They gave shape to the day. They gave a man a place to stand. And now, many of those anchors feel unstable. The work exists but rarely feels meaningful. The stability is technically present but psychologically fragile. The progress, that one is harder to locate. And without those familiar external structures, without the old map of what a man is supposed to be building toward, something quieter takes its place. A kind of ambient confusion, an ongoing, low-level uncertainty about what it all actually means. Maybe that's where it starts. Not with a single event, just a slow drift away from something that used to feel solid. There's a behavior pattern that shows up in men navigating this kind of quiet internal erosion. And it's so common that it's almost invisible. They get very good at functioning, almost suspiciously good. They develop a kind of emotional autopilot that allows them to move through days, weeks, sometimes years, without ever fully stopping to examine what's happening underneath. They answer the emails, they show up to the meetings, they make the plans, keep the commitments, maintain the surface of a life that looks, from a reasonable distance, like someone who is doing fine. And in some ways, this is genuinely impressive. The capacity to keep functioning under sustained psychological pressure is real, but it comes at a cost that accumulates slowly and then, at some point, becomes very difficult to ignore. The cost shows up in small ways first. A growing difficulty feeling genuinely interested in things that used to feel engaging. A flatness that descends over evenings that should feel like rest, but instead feel like empty space. The strange experience of achieving something, finishing a project, completing a goal, and feeling almost nothing in response. Not disappointment, exactly. More like absence. Like the emotional reward that was supposed to arrive simply didn't show up. Psychologists sometimes describe this as anhedonia, the reduced ability to feel pleasure in response to things that previously generated it. But that clinical framing misses something important about how it actually feels to live inside it. It doesn't feel like a symptom. It feels like a personality change. It feels like you've slowly become someone slightly less alive than you used to be. and you can't identify exactly when that happened or why. And here's the part that doesn't get discussed enough. Modern culture has built an extraordinary number of escape routes from this feeling, and most of them are available instantly, at any hour, on a device that never leaves your hand. The algorithm understands exhaustion. The attention economy was specifically designed to serve people in states exactly like this one. Stimulation that requires nothing, content that demands no emotional labor, consumption that feels like activity while actually being the opposite of it. So a man comes home from a day of sustained performance. He's been competent and present and useful. He's held himself together in all the ways that were required. And now, in the quiet of an evening that should theoretically belong to him, he doesn't reach for connection or rest or reflection. He reaches for stimulation, for something that fills the silence without requiring anything back. And 3 hours disappear into a screen, and he goes to sleep slightly later than he intended, slightly more hollow than before, and wakes up and does it again. This isn't weakness. That's worth saying clearly. This is what happens when a person has been operating at a sustained emotional cost without adequate recovery. The nervous system finds the path of least resistance. The brain seeks stimulation that doesn't demand vulnerability or effort or genuine presence. It's a completely logical response to a genuinely exhausting set of conditions. But the uncomfortable truth is that the escape routes make the underlying condition worse. Not immediately. Immediately they work. That's precisely what makes them so effective and so difficult to step away from. The relief is real. The problem is that it's temporary and it accumulates its own kind of cost over time. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the capacity for genuine presence, for real engagement, for emotional depth, starts to require more effort to access. Not because it's gone, but because it's been quietly starved of the conditions it needs to function. There's something specific that happens to men inside prolonged emotional isolation, and it's worth slowing down on because it's one of the least discussed dynamics in modern life. Most men don't experience their isolation as isolation. They experience it as independence, as self-sufficiency, as simply not being someone who needs a lot from other people. And for a while, that framing holds. It feels like a reasonable description of who they are. It doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a personality trait. But underneath that, something quieter is operating. The gradual contraction of the emotional world. The slow narrowing of the space where genuine connection used to exist. Not because the desire for connection disappeared, but because somewhere along the way, the pathways to it became overgrown from disuse. And now, when connection is theoretically available, when the moment exists, when someone is actually present and willing, there's a strange difficulty accessing it. A kind of internal distance that wasn't always there. Men are not socialized to track this in themselves. That's not an accusation, it's an observation about what gets taught and what doesn't. From very early, the emotional education most men receive is structured around management rather than expression, around containing rather than articulating, around projecting stability rather than admitting uncertainty, and those patterns become deeply embedded. They become automatic. They operate below conscious awareness. So when the emotional world starts contracting, when the loneliness quietly intensifies, when the sense of being genuinely known by another person starts feeling like a distant memory, most men don't identify it as a problem requiring attention. They identify it as just how things are. They adapt. They find ways to fill the space that don't require vulnerability. And the adaptation is so complete, so thorough, that the original loss becomes almost invisible. If these kinds of quieter conversations about modern life feel strangely familiar, the kind that don't offer easy answers, but at least try to see things honestly, you're welcome to stay around. There's more of this here. The social dimension of this collapse is strange and worth examining, because modern men are, in many ways, more connected than any generation before them. Constantly reachable, perpetually visible, available across multiple platforms at any hour. And yet the quality of connection, the actual depth of it, the felt sense of being genuinely present with another person who genuinely sees you, that has become rarer. Not absent, but thinner somehow, more mediated, more performed. There's a specific texture to male friendship in modern life that's different from what it was even 20 years ago. The friendships exist, but they often operate at a certain emotional altitude. Comfortable, familiar, but rarely descending into the kind of conversation where something real gets said, where someone admits that they're struggling, where the mask comes off for long enough that actual contact happens. Most men can tell you the names of their friends. Fewer can tell you the last time one of those friends actually knew how they were doing. Not the surface answer, the real one. And this matters more than it might seem, because human beings are not designed for sustained emotional isolation. The nervous system requires genuine connection the way the body requires sleep. It's not optional. It's not a preference. It's a biological need that, when chronically unmet, produces very real psychological consequences. Increased anxiety, heightened stress responses, difficulty regulating emotion, a pervasive sense of unreality about one's own life, a quiet but persistent feeling that something important is missing, even when everything externally appears to be in order. The strange irony is that the more competently a man manages his isolation, the less visible the cost becomes to others and, eventually, to himself. The performance of okayness becomes indistinguishable from actual okayness, and that's perhaps the most quietly dangerous part of the whole dynamic. Not the collapse itself, but the invisibility of it. The way it can proceed for years inside a person who, by every external measure, seems to be doing fine. There's a question that sits underneath all of this, and it's one that most men never quite get to ask out loud. Not because they haven't felt it, but because the conditions for asking it rarely present themselves. The question is something like, what am I actually building toward? Not in the career sense, not in the financial planning sense. Something deeper than that. A genuine uncertainty about what the shape of a meaningful life is supposed to look like now, in this specific moment in history, for a man navigating all of these pressures simultaneously, because the old blueprints don't quite fit anymore. The version of masculinity that previous generations inherited, the one organized around provision and stoicism and external achievement as the primary measures of worth, that version has been, rightly, questioned and complicated. But what replaced it isn't entirely clear. There's been a lot of deconstruction and not quite enough construction. And men who genuinely want to live differently, who sense that the old model wasn't working and aren't interested in returning to it, often find themselves in a strange middle space. Released from one set of expectations, but not yet holding something coherent to replace them with. That ambiguity is its own kind of weight. Maybe that's part of the problem. Not that men don't want to change or grow or exist differently in the world, but that the cultural moment hasn't quite provided a clear emotional language for what that looks like in practice. In the ordinary Tuesday of a real life, in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, in the conversation that needs to happen but keeps getting postponed, in the quiet moment when someone asks how you're doing and you say fine, automatically, before you've even checked. And this is where the financial and the psychological and the relational all converge into something unified. Because the pressure to perform financial stability, the pressure to perform emotional stability, the pressure to perform a version of yourself that requires no support and generates no inconvenience, all of that performance is exhausting in a way that compounds across years. It doesn't arrive as crisis. It arrives as a gradual dimming, a slow reduction in the intensity with which a man inhabits his own life. Things that used to feel vivid start feeling muted. Experiences that should generate presence instead feel like they're happening at a slight remove, as if observed rather than lived. The inner life becomes quieter not because it's peaceful, but because something in the system has learned to turn the volume down as a form of protection. And after long enough, the quiet starts feeling normal, which sounds dramatic, but honestly, it really isn't. It's just what sustained pressure without adequate release eventually produces in a human being. The uncomfortable and also somehow relieving truth is that none of this is personal failure. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because the instinct, particularly for men, is to locate the problem inside themselves, to interpret the exhaustion as weakness, to read the emotional flatness as a character flaw, to understand the difficulty connecting as evidence of something fundamentally broken in who they are. And that interpretation, that relentless self-diagnosis as the source of the problem, adds its own layer of weight to an already heavy situation. But what's actually happening is both simpler and more structural than personal failure. A generation of men is navigating a set of economic, social, psychological, and cultural conditions that are genuinely difficult, that produce genuine strain, that would produce genuine strain in anyone carrying them, regardless of how strong or capable or together they appeared from the outside. The collapse, when it comes, isn't a weakness revealing itself. It's a system reaching the limits of what it can sustain without acknowledgement and without support. And acknowledgement, it turns out, is not a small thing. There's a reason that simply being seen, Simply having someone reflect back accurately what you're actually experiencing produces such immediate and disproportionate relief. It's not because people are fragile, it's because carrying something unacknowledged requires a constant expenditure of energy that disappears the moment the thing is named. The weight doesn't vanish, but it changes character. It becomes something you're holding rather than something holding you. Most men will not read this as a call to some dramatic transformation. That's not really what this is. Dramatic transformations are, mostly, a story we tell ourselves about change. Real change is quieter and stranger and more incremental than that. It looks like a conversation that goes slightly deeper than usual. Like a moment of honesty that feels risky and turns out to be okay. Like sitting with discomfort long enough to notice what's actually underneath it instead of immediately reaching for something to make it stop. It looks like a man, somewhere, late at night, putting down his phone and sitting in the quiet for a few minutes and allowing himself to notice, without judgment, that he's tired. Not just physically, the other kind. And instead of immediately managing that feeling or redirecting it or filling the silence with something that requires nothing, just acknowledging it, to himself at least, which sounds like almost nothing, and is somehow the beginning of something. The silent collapse of modern men is real, but silence was never the only option. It was just, for a long time, the most available one. And awareness, even quiet awareness, even the kind that arrives late at night in an ordinary room with no dramatic resolution attached to it, awareness changes something. Not everything, not immediately, but something. Maybe that's enough for tonight.